The Why Didn't You Test That podcast want to improve your software. Join Huw, Rich and their guests. They share experiences and insights on the many sides of better software delivery.
Hey Rich, how's it going, man?
Yeah, very good, thank you.
Good. Okay, so an amazing chat with Tom. He is a special person in that he actually really does go down into the weeds. And it's kind of amazing some of the stuff that he kind of dug up. I loved his talk about the kind of the gambler and the skeptic, which sort of let's start with the first kind of bit of the conversation. And I mean, the reality is it doesn't really matter whether you're a gambler or a skeptic. You basically wake up in the morning and you're not motivated to change your behavior in kind of any way. So I think the motivation of people is maybe that we should just talk about that, about why there isn't a push from management down into, the middle tiers. The middle tiers are made up of sort of endless reams of project managers who are trying to deliver. And we've now moved into the wonderful world of, almost, death by Jira. I mean, it's just all about, getting this done, getting the feature right. There's very little sort of sitting above that to say, well, okay, let's, and we can talk about this on other podcasts about, how do you actually change the way that you behave so you deliver better, faster, and, and all the wonderful things that are actually out there. So, but when it comes to the concept of using live data, which is, I don't care how much you mask it, it still contains, commercially sensitive information. There's just tons and tons of interesting information in there that is of use to someone with nefarious purposes. And also most people don't want that data to be used by, it doesn't matter what, whether you bought something in a shop or whether it's your healthcare records, it doesn't really apply. However, when it comes down to these sort of the layer of project managers, from what I've seen in companies, they've sort of set up this separate, data security team who is focused about sort of, filling in the cracks around the walls with the organization. And there's just an incredible amount of effort that goes into that side of the world, all the various different, encryption methods and, you've got some Java, which has got some open source code in it, which can do that. And you've got all of this tension to this sort of, incredibly complex lock. Meanwhile, there's a great big fence with holes in it, in that everyone's just basically throwing data out at people. So I think the priorities of organizations has become massively skewed. We move to the cloud and we're a software company, and the amount of hoops that we have to go through to actually, and we come in and say, look, we've got, we're basically bringing in a fence. And they say, yeah, but you haven't got a 9-bar lock. And you're like, well, that's kind of irrelevant. But getting back to that, so the point about it is the organizations are sort of skewed. You do have kind of sort of data privacy officers, and they kind of involve, but no offense, but it does seem to be a bit of a side. It doesn't really get any kind of recognition in the organization. It's certainly not involved in, the setup of projects. They sort of almost like a little research team that sits off the side, researches and sends out a memo every now and again, and maybe runs, a training course, and then they disappear off into the weeds.
I think there's I mentioned agile theatre last time. I think there's an element of controls theatre that goes on, by which, like you say, right, you've got this control securities team or audit team, internal audit team that are almost. They're detached from the work that's going on, right, and therefore they're doing controls by check sheets, and it's an odd one by which you've got a delivery team that is, like you say, right, a feature factory, date driven, almost very insular in the way that they're looking, and then you've got this detached team that are working their way through a checkboard of things that are slightly irrelevant to actually the topic.
Yeah.
And you've got this mismatch, right? And therefore, there is an elephant in the room around, are we actually looking at the right controls in a lot of organizations, I think?
We talked about this before when I was slightly scathing about the people that actually run companies, in that they are not in IT. However, they are aware of legislation around there, so they probably are a bit of a gambler skeptic, and they are not pushing this down into the organization. They're not recognizing the risks. The only time they recognize the risks is when someone comes and finds them, and then it's a cost of business, because they say, oh well, there we are. They then go talk to their project managers, and I'll come on to my presentation at EUROStar, who basically come up with the phrase, well, it's impossible to test without production data. End of. And then they sort of collude with them then, and they don't really go and say, well, actually, that's totally not true. That is, that's 100%.
Do you think though there's a few problems with organisations coming to play in there, right? You've got in the very first, you've got the command and control. GDPR incident happens, command and control hierarchy, person at the top pushes it down to project manager beneath them. Mm-hmm. Then you've got the dynamic of task-driven feature factory. Oh, I've got this thing I need to do, and therefore push it onto my team to do it. Now, the problem with that is GDPR in itself, there is a lot of guidance, but in itself, it needs to be interpreted by the individual organisation. Mm-hmm. And that bit's missing, right? And therefore, you do the task to get a check in the box to say we're GDPR compliant, but it hasn't had any real good analysis as to what it actually means.
Yeah. I mean, there's a sort of moral thing here. There's all sorts of legislation about social media, etc., but it's usually lagging, 5 to 10 years behind what's going on in the real world. Yeah. So, but the moral intention of it is absolutely clear, But in IT, then that's almost lost. It's almost just sort of vanishes. People just say, well, okay, fine. There was no other way. We need to get the feature out the door, and that's it. And that, as you say, imperative is kind of dominates what's going on out there. Now, what I'm going to do is kind of try and tee you up a little bit, because you spent a long time in the real world, and I spent a long time in the visionary world of, you should be doing this, you should be doing that. So anyway, I did a presentation at EUROStar, which was basically about get production data out of your testing, and I sort of sauntered into the room, and it was one of the biggest halls, and there was standing room only. So first of all, the first question I said was, why are you all here? Hopefully next year when I'm doing this presentation, I don't want any of you in the room. I was kind of hoping there would only be about half a dozen of you. We've obviously got a big problem here. Got a bit of a laugh. My feedback, by the way, was that was amazing presentation, number one. Number two, who is this guy? So arrogant. He thinks that, you can't use the production data, has absolutely no use in here. So although I got a relatively high score, there was some quite sort of visceral hatred coming back in the comments from me. And I mean, I think I sort of went over, Tom prepared some of the slides, so I kind of went over some of the stuff there and kind of tried to scare people a little bit. But then I sort of talked about, I did a sort of, thought experiment. If you walked in tomorrow and you weren't allowed to use any production data, or you weren't allowed to copy any data in, what would you all do? And someone just immediately said, well, we'd all just leave, which I found a bit depressing, and they're all going to walk out the door. There's just no way that they could do their job without that access to production data, which was kind of a bit pants, to be honest. And I thought it was a bit of a weak, it was a very poor thought experiment in that they didn't really think of any other ways to kind of solve that problem. The other thing I kind of challenged them to, it was at a testing conference. I didn't actually say it, but I'm going to say it now, is that most testing is pretty much don't understand how to test systems. There's so many misterms, coverage, integration testing, unit testing. It's almost like buzzword compliant, ISTQB, we've done this, we've used combinatorial, we've done all this stuff. But actually, most people don't understand about how you actually test something. There's black box testing, there's white box testing, there's observability. Can I observe that you've got this, that I got the right result for the right reason? I was thinking about actually your the Swindon mini roundabout, the magic roundabout, where basically you've got sort of 7 ways in, 7 ways out, but you've got something like 5 different switches in the middle. Now, if you just cast a big black box over a roof on the top of that, you would just have 7 ways in, 7 ways out. And cars would go in, cars would come out, and you would have no way of testing it. But you can observe whether cars go left and right at a roundabout, And if you actually break things down and say, well, how would we test that this is working correctly? You'd basically need to add in probably somewhere in the region of three observable points, and then you could test that. Now, this comes from the science of testing. It's cause and effect modeling. Now, there's no sort of underpinning intellectual heft to the testing industry where these types of things are thought about fundamentally. And the idea is that you need to come up with a minimum number of tests to prove that your requirement has worked and it is observable and you get the right results for the right reason. And also when you build a system, that you build it with testability in mind. If you change the testing industry to use that as their mantra, it's become, in my mind, a bit smug. I think it's just sort of, it's become I come to work and I'm a tester, and I give myself some awards. I'm being quite critical here. But if you don't understand those fundamentals, then you don't understand how to test. And if you understand how to test, it's all about the data and the decision gates. So you shouldn't be worrying about production data in the slightest. It is completely irrelevant to testing whether a system works. And I said it a little bit nicer than that, but I think that is really the fundamental problem. Now, over to you, mate. How do we break that?
Absolutely agree, right? I think, to me, if you're using live data for anything in terms of testing or earlier on in the life cycle in terms of design, it's a demonstration that you don't know something, right? And therefore, the scary thing is that not just you might be lazy if if your response as a tester, if you couldn't use live data, you're going to leave. Actually, there is massive risk to the system you're testing going wrong, because you've got a hell of a lot of unknowns in there, and the only way that you think you can understand the system today is to take a copy of what production does, right? And that's a pretty low bar in terms of understanding how your system works, because the chances are, right, if you've got an aged system, right, you've got some corrupt data in probably in your production system. You've got probably rules in there that probably aren't what you think work in the way that you think you are, right? Especially where you've got large batch systems that are quite complex, and that new system won't have anything to do with the new changes that are coming along, right? So you're building up entropy. I like that word now, and essentially. You're introducing more and more, the more you choose to not understand your system, chaos and disorder into your system going forward. So you're building up this technical debt, and there's going to be a car crash in the future, right? And your only mitigation to that today is to take a copy of live data and not get any worse at best. But chances are you are going to, right? So I think for us, where I've kind of come from, financial services, right? We had a large imperative to move away from that kind of status quo, if you like, of understanding how our systems work through taking copies of production, because of data protection back in the day, right? This is pre-GDPR. But actually, we needed to change the narrative. Yes, we needed to get a tick in the box to make sure that we were being compliant, but also, actually, we have probably a much bigger risk, conduct risk, if you're from financial services, around, actually, if you don't make sure this thing works, then you're going to get some negative outcomes, right? Be that negative outcomes for customers in terms of the processes again happening in the right way, outages, and if you know these things, it becomes a way up between regulatory GDPR compliance versus conduct risk. I think the real headspin then becomes, if you know that you've got conduct risk because you don't know these things, then you need to address that thing the next time, right? And therefore, at best, using live data to mitigate the fact that you've got unknowns, you can only do that once, right? And if you do that more than once, then I'm afraid, if as a material risk taker in that organisation, you've got some questions to answer, right? And it's a long journey. Don't get me wrong, right? It takes a long time to build up that level of disorder in your organisation, and therefore, the best way that you can start to face into those things is analysis, right? And I think you hit the nail on the head and bring them together in terms of the testing industry. If you look at a lot of the conversation, it talks about test automation, right? And therefore, all we're talking about is test execution.
Yeah.
There's hardly any conversation about test design or systems thinking, right? And that is a real worry in terms of, okay, so I run 1,000 tests through automation. Yeah, but there's probably a shed load of rubbish duplicated tests that are kind of scratching the surface on how that system actually works. So it's almost a total rethink in terms of what are the skills that a tester needs to make an organization effective in the way that they do test. But more than that, right, I think as you start to introduce good structure, right, and you're going to do that through analysis, and modeling is a great example of this, right? You're introducing that structure through the control. So how do you design through data security in mind, for example? You build that into a model, right? Now that model is going to give you predictability, repetition in what you're actually doing. When you make change to a system, you're going to understand where that change is going to have impact, i.e. you know where the blast radius is going to stop. And actually, you've got the bedrock for doing actual good automation. And the fact that, you know,
dynamic automation, I think, is the phrase. I mean, I think, you know, I when I'm, you know, doing presentations on, you know, Test Modeler, you know, you should be able to spin up the right type of automated tests. So you might say, well, look, for this sprint, we're just going to basically build 10,000 automated tests because we want to just test it to death. Once we've tested all those decision gates, we're done. We don't need those tests anymore. Throw them away, because the only thing you would ever then the next set of automated tests would be just for those logic gates or those requirement logic gates that have changed, and then you build the test cases to test those and observe that those are correct. So the next sprint you might only have 10 automated tests because you've only changed one thing. And I think this idea of dynamic automated testing is just you know, should be the fundamentals of how you test. I mean, we know, I've just come off a meeting with one of the devs, and you know, we've got a really critical piece of change that we're putting into this into the kind of release procedures of our product. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to model in this case, we're going to go for an exhaustive set of test cases, but we only need to do them once. You know, we're going to probably end up with somewhere in the region of 100 of them. We might automate it, but we're going to just do it once. Then we're done. That's it. We don't need them going forward. We might take one of them and include it into our standard release cycle. But you know, maybe it's because, you know, I guess, you know, we've been banging this particular drum probably for the last 10 to 15 years, so it's kind of, you know, living and breathing to us. But you know, when I'm sort of out there chatting with people, I almost feel like we're talking across each other. You know, when I'm saying words, they're not really understanding what those words mean, and they don't really understand the implication of that in terms of how, you know, a requirement, you should almost say, right, that requirement is going to produce this level of, you know, I talked about it before, how complex the system is, it's how easy is it to test, and then you say, right, well, in this case, the best way to do that, and this is where you should come out test, you should become critical thinkers and say, well, okay, I think what we're going to do is we're going to do that. We're going to design the test cases, we're going to focus on that, and we're going to do them manually in this sprint. We're going to, and as I said, pick two up, put them in the automated test, fine. The next one, they then say, well, now we're much more into variations. You know, for example, you might want to say, well, let's do negative testing. You talk about bad data. Bad data usually gets in because the validation routines are actually, you know, aren't strong enough. And over time, people say, you know, especially when you're in financial service, you get data coming in from all sorts of different places, and they're all in JSON structures, and they have missing elements and all this sort of stuff, and they all come flying in. And because you'll basically go a little bit like that, and things just get through, and then they come in, and then certainly, you know, sort of 2 weeks later, someone, you know, and all the stories you hear about, we basically sent, you know, $100,000, and we refunded the $100,000, and we're $200,000 down here, you know, and that's because someone sent a null through instead of a space or something like that, you know. So this idea of being able to beef up things that are really important and actually spend the time building a ton of automated tests. So what you might want to do then is every single time we come up with just continually improving the set of automated tests on the validation routines. And you can put that in its own VM, and it's just continuously running, and it's total. And that's where you could have loads and loads and loads and loads and loads of automation testing.
I think there's a case not just for, let's say, continuous testing, but continuous analysis, right? That's where I think where we talk about there's going to be bad data in that environment, right? It sounds like a bad thing, right? Because I said it's going to be bad data, right? But it's an inevitability, right? And data evolves, right? And that's really the key here, right? In that actually your data capture systems, there are probably many of them, right? And they're introduced at all different times. But and therefore the standards to which they capture the data probably will be slightly different, purely for the fact it's different people doing it, it's different times, but also those data capture screens in themselves, they're going to evolve, right? As the organization realizes that it needs to capture data in a different way, or it needs to capture different types of information. And therefore, if you have a concept of what's a customer, I don't know, 6 months ago, that might be slightly different than today. And then what do you know, causal chains, if you've then got an interface that takes customer and chucks it into another space, 6 months ago it worked. If you didn't realize that interface has now changed, well, that migration's not going to work, right? And I think, there's probably some high-profile external ones that have probably come across with that, where they've just not been good enough continually understanding, analysing the data structures and how they move about.
It's an interesting space. Maybe we'll come back to this one. I mean, actually, I thought there was an example at your old company, and what had happened is because you took over other building societies, the data that came in didn't have all the information about customers. It didn't have all that stuff, and it was never going to have all that stuff. Now, because you loaded that data in, a lot of these systems didn't work. But those were old accounts. They'd been closed. They'd been moved over to the new accounts, but they were still historically there. But they didn't have the right information. So when you run the reports, it was like, oh. But I mean, the quality of data is in the eye of the beholder, but it's also very time dependent, as you said. So over time, the importance of that bad data or the effect of it is negligible. But that's kind of a balancing that you need to do, kind of generally ongoing. Anyway, we've sort of gone slightly off topic there, but I think one of the things that I've because of, I mean, sometimes the move to the cloud actually kind of has helped, because there's a sort of, if you're using kind of a cloud software, you've got all these controls around your production environments, but then you might say, well, we've got to do some pre-prod and all this sort of stuff, and how are we going to do all that sort of stuff? Now, I guess the sort of things that I'm seeing with one or two customers, and actually with the way that we do it, our biggest user of our software is us, in that because we've got lots of people preparing demos to demonstrate the product, and we're setting up all sort of complex scenarios to show the really cool stuff in it, we're continually using it. And actually we find, bugs, usability issues. So, I was just thinking about it over the last couple of days. If you've got an organization, you generally find one or two people who are users now, who are the kind of, if you have a question, you usually go find them. In the old days, we all used to sit in offices, used to wander over and say, Mary, how the hell does that work? And on the screen it does this, but we don't do that. What we normally do is we post it over here, and then that would then trigger this, and you go like, great, fantastic. Now, Mary is actually the perfect person, if you can take them off, 1 day a week and say, you're now basically part of the development team, and we're going to set you up an environment. I want you to come in and do your job, and you're going to do it on the next release, and you're going to do it on the next 2 releases. You're going to do it against the dev release, the QA one, and the pre-prod release, and that's what your job is, because you have all the experience and the knowledge. Firstly the look and feel, but also you understand the data flows, and then maybe when people join the organization, they come into that environment and they actually sit there processing claims or putting stuff into that organization. That doesn't need to be an enormous team, but actually they're putting live data in. So they would be taking data from, you could basically simulate a claim coming in, and you just basically simulate some activities, and building the sort of synthetic raw input would be really easy to do, because you're not actually, you wouldn't use, a live claim. You just create a claim based on something like that. So you're not having to create synthetic data across the entire thing. You're just creating the initial inputs. And addresses or whatever, use libraries or something like that. So you could basically create that little organization. And that organization, if they worked with the development team, first of all, you would start developing much better software earlier, as opposed to this, we got a bunch of BAs, they go talk to the user, they come back over here, they do this, then they talk to the test teams, then they That's really a dynamic way of doing it. And I'm thinking I've talked about in the old podcast in the old days. I mean, I genuinely used to pick up an old mainframe, one of those really heavy things, and drag it into one of my users' rooms and go and sit in his office for Standard & Poor's and sit there next to him, and I would design the screen next to him. So we had the developer close to the user, but if you think about, then you have these power users plus the trainee users coming into that, and being able to create this kind of simulated bank, simulated claims, simulated healthcare thing, whatever it is. And that really should be pushing the boundaries, because as we talk about production data, probably only ever touches about 20% of the code. What you should really be doing in that little group is maybe driving through up to 40 to 50% of the code, and also all the new stuff, because all the new stuff would then be tested, all those logic gates, etc., all that metadata would be hammered. So I think if organizations can maybe kind of reconfigure and bring the users in earlier, and think about these power users, and maybe just have awards. I mean, I love the way that you sort of talk about centralization, and what's the other phrase you use? You're an affiliate, federated, sorry. Yeah. So you've got a federated approach. So you come in and you give people awards, and people come into that. I think just that reconfiguration it's really simple. I mean, it's nothing hard.
It is. I think there's an interesting point, right, in terms of you've got you've got a black box of you don't know where the system, right? And therefore, like you say, your business user becomes the power user, right? I think there's an interesting point in if you followed that the whole way through. The challenge is they only know the system from a black box point of view, right? So the outcome can only be a monolith afterwards. Your challenge becomes how do you use that up front, but then take your approach that you want to do. So if you're trying to follow DevOps or Agile, for example, you almost need. We did this at Nationwide, right? And we called them Team Ferret, right? It was an analysis team. We didn't know how the black box worked necessarily, and therefore worked with the power users to understand how they would interact with the black box, and then essentially make white box components of it eventually. And so, yes, we could go monolithic, but actually, what we were trying to do is create an agile implementation to which we could then pick off pieces of the solution and make changes to it in a little agile way. Right, and therefore it became a white box. So I think, yes, absolutely, the users need to be there, but you need to be conscious that actually you're not just building out another monolith.
The other thing, I mean, when I did my EUROStar, one of the things I talked about was fine. There's 250 people in this room. You need to start thinking about how you're going to move away from this, And I talked about synthetic, and it's, there's when you say synthetic, I mean, we're actually doing some work with some of the analysts at the moment. As usually, analysts, got the wrong end of the stick, and they kind of, broken it down into the wrong different things. And so this idea of synthetic data, the advantage we have now is like we've got all this extra complexity now because we've got APIs and you've got Kafka messages and all this stuff flying around. But actually, that's actually quite a good thing, because all you really need to do is just take maybe 10 or 15 APIs and automate the production of data through those APIs. And as long as you make sure that they refer back to, as you say, your black box radius and the system under test, you pull the reference values from those, and you're doing a little bit of test matching, that's fine. That's going to generate them. You can track the data that's going in and out, and you can actually do a relatively simple job of testing that to a much better than a unit test. You're actually really almost putting it up to a full kind of system test. And that's synthetic data. I mean, so that's one thing. The other thing is, we've started to do these things where people are really kind of worried about that it has the same characteristics of production data. So all we've really done with that is, this is now actually where AI is really good, and there's lots of nice algorithms, and we're actually launching a data gen AI pretty soon. And what we really need to do there is to get some kind of scan from production data. You could probably just use reports. Actually, you don't particularly need. And as long as you obfuscate, you don't care about the names or anything like that. All you care about is the characteristics of that, the different types of accounts, all that kind of stuff. You get that report out of production. You could almost commission it as ask someone to do that and say, if you give me that report, we will be able to create the same types of data. And that's now really routine. And when we can do that, and it's not that hard. And you're going to end up with maybe 100,000 transactions each day, which simulate production. And you could almost just think of that as your gold copy database, which I hate that term.
Absolutely, yeah.
If you said, okay, we're going to create 100,000 transactions based on what happened in development yesterday and production yesterday, fine. Those go into your system. Then what you then do is to say, well, let's overlay that with the requirements that we're working on. And that's where you say, well, actually, we're splitting this code into 7, HIPAA or something like that. And you now have 7 codes. Now, for that one, you get into modeling, you model the variations, and you might add in 200 or 300 or 400 variations on that. So you've got your 100,000 plus your 200 or 300, but you're actually, if you think about the code coverage and your requirements coverage, that's now pretty much shot up. So the combination of the characteristics of production data with the modeled requirement, I think, is a much more sophisticated and dynamic and quicker way of being able to test a system. This whole idea of production data is always out of date, by the time you've got it over there, and the amount of grief that you have to do to go through that. Whereas actually, if you just said, look, let's spend a week deciding the characteristics that we care about, which are business decisions, things that affect a business decision, things that are going to, in effect, do a requirement switch, bring that data back in, create that, and fine, that will evolve. You'll have your small test data engineer keeping that up to date if something changes. Then you have your requirements modeling, where you're modeling out the variations, and you lay that on the top of it. You chuck in some virtual databases, you've got your environment sorted, you've got your test data sorted, and you've got it all joined up back with your sort of agile DevOps methodology. So maybe that's kind of a better way to go.
I think there's an interesting angle wider than just kind of. There's an obvious one in terms of performance testing, right? And the amount of times that we will go to some people to try functional testing. Small, for me, you're looking at a one-to-one relationship between test case and data, and that's linked to the rule that you're trying to trigger in the testing. When you get into non-functionals and performance testing, for example, you're looking for the profile of the data to exercise the system the way that production would do. But I think the interesting part is when you go and ask for those kind of things from the data teams, and everybody's got a data and engineering capability in their organization today, but yet they can't answer that question for you, right? And you kind of think, hang on a minute, surely there's synergy between what I'm asking you and how you understand how good or what the profile of our customers are, but yet we don't know those things. Yeah. So I think there's definitely synergy and benefit moreover than kind of just in test.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a massive benefit in terms of analysing and kind of upping the bar in terms of how the organisation understands data.
Yeah, so I think if we think this is probably a good place to end now, because if we pick up on that now, so if you think about trying to bring these very bright people spread out across the organization that become siloed. If you think about the business intelligence team who do an enormous amount of data mining, you think about your ferret team, I love that. You think about people who are building continuous delivery pipelines. You think about, say, your critical tester, you think about your visionaries in the company and how they struggle to get anything done, which I would say is an extraordinary problem, which we should really kind of, almost talk about as, sort of organizational drift there. But maybe we should come back to that as the next one. But I think we kind of explored, some of the issues around this kind of GDPR using production data. And so, yeah, good combo as usual there, Rich.
Cool.
Good. All right, lad. Chat to you next time.
Nice one. Yeah. See you later. Then.
See ya. Bye-bye.
The Why Didn't You Test That podcast. Thanks for listening. Show notes via the link.